We start the hour in West Africa, where the historic trial of a former president has concluded. A court in Senegal has sentenced Chad's former ruler, Hissene Habre, to life in prison for crimes against humanity committed during his administration. CCTV's Clementine Logan has more.
It's the first time an African Union-backed court has tried a former ruler for human rights abuses. The landmark case led by Senegal saw Hissene Habre convicted of crimes against humanity. He was sentenced to life in prison for rape, sexual slavery and ordering killings during his rule from 1982 to 1990.
The chamber concludes, after taking into account the gravity of the crimes committed and the personal situation of Hissene Habre, that the aggravating factors far outweigh the mitigating ones. Therefore, Hissene Habre, the chamber sentences you to life imprisonment.
Habre didn't respond when called on by the judge. He's refused to recognize the court's legitimacy ever since his arrest in Senegal in 2013, where he'd been in exile. That same year, the country's extraordinary African chambers were inaugurated to prosecute those responsible for crimes committed in Chad during Habre's rule. It took judges 19 months to gather enough evidence for Habre to face charges of crimes against humanity and torture. In one of the most dramatic moments of the trial, the former head of state had to be dragged into court after refusing to appear before judges, denouncing it as a farce. Throughout the trial, Habre looked on silently as dozens of witnesses recounted atrocities. Monday's verdict marks the end of a 16-year battle by victims and rights campaigners to bring Hissene Habre to justice. Clementine Logan, CCTV.
Now, meanwhile, Reid Brody, a lawyer for Human Rights Watch who has spent the last 15 years working with victims to bring Habre to justice, said the conviction was a warning to other repressive rulers. The case was heard by a special tribunal set up by the African Union under a deal with Senegal. Victims who had travelled to Dakar to hear the verdict were visibly moved by a judgment that comes a quarter of a century after the abuses they suffered.
Africans are elated because we have sent a strong message for all the tyrants across the world, in Africa and particularly in Chad.
This sentence is the culmination of 25 years of work. Today will go down in history as the day when a group of survivors managed to bring the dictator to justice. The fact that he was convicted not only for crimes against humanity, war crimes and torture, but especially rape for having personally raped someone is a first in international justice. A former head of state convicted of raping a woman shows that no leader is so powerful that they are above the law and no woman is below the law.
Right, well, let's bring you some analysis on this historic case. We're now joined here in our Nairobi studio by James Mamboleo, the Dean at the African Nazarene University Law School here in Nairobi. Mr. Mamboleo, thanks very much for joining us this evening. Now,
you're welcome.
Certainly a long wait for justice for the victims in this particular case, but just talk us through perhaps the significance, or at least why this particular trial and conviction is an achievement for Africa.
A big significance for Africa because we're just coming from the throes of the case against Kenyan leaders in The Hague. And one of the biggest discussions we've had is, can the African continent fashion a solution to its own criminal problems? And right now we have seen the African Union having established a court in Senegal which has tried successfully the Chadian dictator who left office about 25 years ago. So the biggest significance here for me is Africa can indeed establish a mechanism for dealing with its own problems, including issues relating to international crimes.
And that one is to wonder then whether or not this is now slowly but surely going to replace the International Criminal Court. And even if the AU has shown its capacity to try leaders, does it really have the appetite to do so?
That's an important question because whereas this year looks like a success, I can't tell for the long run really how the African Union is going to respond in respect especially of other leaders who might be charged of such kind of crimes. The truth of the matter is there's a possibility that the African Union might not run so many of these leaders to court. But however, the significance I think for us is that where the will is present, for instance, like in this case, the African continent can actually fashion a mechanism that can bring these leaders to justice.
And what about those leaders themselves that need to be brought to justice? Does this case stand as a warning to those leaders that are not being held accountable for violations of human rights?
Surely, because it tells leaders in power that one day there's a possibility you could actually face justice in one of these courts. There's a possibility that some of these leaders, of course, will not let go of power anytime soon, but you can never tell how things will go, so they are basically now on the path to understanding that they're going to be responsible eventually over the crimes that they might commit while in office. It's a big challenge. We know that most of these African leaders will not let go of power, but if eventually they do, there's a possibility that they could actually be tried and found guilty of some of these crimes that they commit while in office.
Now, it seems that one of the things that emerged during the course of this trial was that Habre's administration didn't always act alone. In fact, in some instances, it's believed they had assistance from the United States government. They had a lot of support from them, at least during the time of his administration.
Yes.
Is there any sense at all then that other powers might be held responsible for their role, for aiding and abetting or being complicit in some way in those human rights abuses?
To be honest, no. But what that tells us is the rest of the world, especially the big players in the international community, should begin to understand that they should not take positions such as this. For instance, it's extremely unfortunate that the U.S. Used Habre as a bulwark against, I think, Muammar Gaddafi at the time. And they supported his administration. They created a behemoth in Chad who, through the power that he gained, used that power to suppress his people. We have seen this happening across the African continent. European powers, so the United States, coming in and establishing certain leaders in certain countries with the sole purpose of perpetuating their interests in those countries. What happens is that these leaders finally use the power they gain to suppress their own people. So that is extremely dangerous. But as to the question whether they are going to be brought to justice as well, that one I highly doubt.
Likely. Well,
Yeah.
thank you very much for that analysis, Mr.
Yes.
Mamboleo, live here in our Nairobi studio on that historic judgment in Senegal.